New York City, 1,874, and a 9-year-old girl named Mary Ellen Wilson is carried out of a Manhattan tenement on the testimony of a man who argued her case using legal language developed to protect livestock because in the United States of America, in that year, there was no statute that protected a child from her guardian, but there was one that protected a horse. The courtroom accepted the argument. Mary Ellen was removed. The case became famous immediately, held up as the birth of child protection in America, the moment the nation finally turned its institutional gaze toward the suffering of its youngest and most vulnerable people. Newspaper editors called it a watershed moment in American civic life. Reform societies cited it for decades as proof that the system, when confronted with undeniable evidence of cruelty, could correct itself. Politicians pointed to it. Philanthropists framed it. It became, in the telling, a story about a society waking up. What almost no one mentioned then or since, in the textbooks or the commemorations or the museum exhibits, is that at the exact same moment this case was being celebrated as a triumph of child welfare, tens of thousands of children were being legally loaded onto westbound trains, separated from parents who were still breathing, still living in the same city, sometimes in the same neighborhood, given new surnames and new towns, and entered into ledgers that recorded them, with the flat bureaucratic calm of a livestock inventory, as placed, not rescued, not adopted, not reunited with family, not returned, placed. The word sits in those old records like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it creates, moving outward through the archive, through the court records, through the train manifests and the seasonal labor data and the denominational placement patterns, do not resolve into the shape of charity. They resolve into something considerably more uncomfortable. The question that the official story of American philanthropy has never fully answered, has never in fact seriously attempted to answer, is this. If child protection was the stated mission, if saving children was the declared purpose, why did the system so consistently, so efficiently, and so legally remove children from parents who had not died, who had not disappeared, who had not relinquished their children in any document that bears a signature? The answer does not begin in 1874. It begins 20 years earlier, on a Manhattan street corner, with a young man who had already decided, before he had climbed a single tenement staircase or spoken to a single immigrant mother, that poverty and abandonment were the same condition, and that the cure for both was a one-way train ticket west. His name was Charles Loring Brace. He was 26 years old when he founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853. A Yale-educated minister who arrived in New York's Five Points district carrying a theory as fully formed as his conscience was certain. The theory was called placing out. Its logic was, on the surface, almost elegant in its simplicity. New York was producing more destitute children than its orphanages and asylums could absorb. And the rural American West was producing more labor demand than its farms could fill with willing adult workers. The solution appeared geographical: move the children west. Match the surplus of one place to the shortage of another. Frame the transaction as salvation and collect donations accordingly. Between 10,000 and 30,000 children were estimated to be living on or near New York streets in those years, a figure that appeared in city reports and in Brace's own published writing, and that he deployed with the urgency of a man who had already decided what the solution was before the problem had been fully or carefully measured. What his framework did not carefully distinguish what, in fact, it deliberately collapsed into a single, morally legible category was the difference between a child who had no parents and a child whose parents were poor. In the teeming immigrant tenements of the Lower East Side, in the Irish and German communities still reconstructing themselves from the catastrophe of the famine years of the late 1842, child labor on the street was not abandonment. It was not neglect. It was arithmetic. It was a family economy, operating with no margin for error, in which a child selling newspapers or blacking boots or running errands on a public corner was contributing income that held the household above the line between survival and complete collapse. Brace looked at that child and saw moral contagion. He saw the embryo of the criminal class he would later describe in his 1872 book, which he titled, "With the Characteristic Confidence of a Man Who Had Never Doubted His Own Diagnostic Authority, The Dangerous Classes of New York." The child's mother, if she was alive. If she was at that moment nursing an infant in a third-floor room, or working a 12-hour shift in a garment factory, or trying to stretch 1 week's wages across 10 days of rent and food, she was not part of his calculation. She was, in the moral framework he had already constructed before he arrived, evidence of the problem, rather than a person with a legal and human claim on her own child. The intake forms of the Children's Aid Society had a designated field for parental status. What is remarkable, and what becomes impossible to explain as administrative accident when you examine enough of them, is how frequently the notation in that field reads not orphan but parent living. Location known followed, without pause, without any intervening legal proceeding recorded on the page, by the words placed, Indiana farm or placed, Missouri household or placed, Nebraska family. The gap between those two notations, parent alive and known, child placed hundreds of miles away, is not a clerical anomaly appearing in a handful of records. It appears with sufficient consistency across the archived ledgers held at the University of Minnesota's Social Welfare History Archives to constitute a pattern. And a pattern of that kind, sustained across decades of institutional operation, is not explained by administrative carelessness. The system had a category for orphans. It simply, and with remarkable consistency, did not require that the category be verified before a child was moved 800 miles from the only world they had ever known, from the only people who knew their name before the new one was assigned. The legal mechanism that made this possible was not a child welfare statute. No such thing meaningfully existed in mid-19th century American law. What existed was a vagrancy ordinance, and in New York, as in most American cities of the 1,850 seconds, the legal threshold for classifying a child as a vagrant was the visible, unsupervised presence on a public street. No parent needed to be notified. No court appearance was required. A child seen unattended could be classified, collected, and transferred to the Children's Aid Society's custody within hours, legally, without appeal, without any record of parental objection, because no mechanism existed for that objection to be formally registered. Sister Irene Fitzgibbon, who founded the New York Foundling Hospital in 1869 and operated a competing Catholic placement system that would eventually send its own trains west, applied different intake standards from the beginning, requiring documentation of confirmed abandonment or verified orphan status before a child entered her care. The contrast between the two institutions is not subtle and was not accidental. One required proof of what it claimed to be addressing. The other required only opportunity and proximity. The answer to why this differential was legally permissible was not in child law, because child law did not yet exist in any form that meaningfully constrained institutional behavior toward children of the poor. The answer was in property law, specifically in the municipal doctrine that authorized local authorities to remove from public spaces anything classified as a public nuisance or a public charge. Children, in the legal architecture of 1854, occupied a position in American law considerably closer to removable property than to persons possessed of rights that an institution was obligated to respect. The train, when it came, was simply the logical and geographical terminus of that legal architecture, the point at which removal became permanent, distance became uncrossable on foot, and the original family became, for practical purposes, unreachable. The first train departed New York in 1854. 46 children. Destination: Dowagiac, Michigan. The program that would eventually move 250,000 human beings across the North American continent began with no federal oversight, no return mechanism, no tracking system adequate to locate a child years after placement, no legal framework governing what would happen to these children once they arrived in a receiving town, and no requirement that any receiving family demonstrate fitness beyond a willingness to take a child and a neighbor willing to vouch for their general character. This is where the official story, the story of noble rescue, of forward-thinking American philanthropy, of Charles Loring Brace as a visionary hero of the Reformed tradition, begins to develop its first and most consequential fracture. Because the placing out system was not, in any honest accounting of its operational record, a failure. It was extraordinarily, precisely, and systematically efficient. And that efficiency, when examined against the train manifests and the seasonal patterns visible in the placement data, reveals a set of purposes that no institution connected to the program ever publicly acknowledged or defended in print. The train manifests the physical ledgers recording which children traveled on which trains, in which months, to which destinations, show a pattern that does not correlate with spikes in urban child welfare emergencies. It correlates with agricultural cycles. Children aged 6 to 14 moved west in the spring planting season. A second wave of placements followed in the late summer months, aligned with harvest. The farms that received them needed hands at precisely those moments, and the ages of the children placed old enough to perform sustained physical labor, young enough to be entirely outside the protection of any law, were not a coincidence of which children happened to be available. The children were not being saved from the street, they were being delivered to the field. The placing out system solved three simultaneous institutional problems. It reduced the visible population of poor immigrant children in New York, easing a genuine political and fiscal pressure that the city's Protestant establishment found both morally destabilizing and publicly expensive. It supplied seasonal and domestic labor to rural communities in states being settled faster than their adult populations could organically sustain. And it addressed, in a manner that was never spoken aloud in any annual report or donor letter, but is legible in the denominational and ethnic patterns of who was placed and where, a Protestant civic anxiety about what Catholic immigrant reproduction, if left uninterrupted in the concentrated spaces of American industrial cities, might eventually produce in terms of political influence and cultural transformation. None of these purposes appeared in a Children's Aid Society fundraising appeal. All of them are visible in the data. The system was not forgotten because it failed. It was quietly retired from the center of the historical narrative because honest accounting of what it had actually been would have required someone to publicly defend goals that had never been publicly stated. By 1880, an estimated 50,000 children had been placed. Trains were routing through 47 states and territories. Receiving towns across Kansas, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and Nebraska had developed a ritual for the arrivals that would, a century later, become one of the most cited and most unsettling details in the scholarly literature on the program. Children were brought to a public space courthouse steps, a church hall, a hotel lobby, a train platform, and presented to the assembled families of the receiving community. They were instructed to stand straight, to smile, to demonstrate physical capability when asked, to show their teeth in the manner that livestock were shown at agricultural market. Families walked among them and selected. Local newspapers ran advance notices of the train's arrivals in the weeks before they came, and those notices drew their vocabulary not from adoption law, which barely existed in enforceable form, and not from child welfare statute, which did not exist in any form that governed these transactions, but from the established language of agricultural and domestic labor acquisition. The legal status of a placed child was, in most receiving states, genuinely, deliberately, and conveniently undetermined, not ward, not servant, not adopted child, not apprentice, but something the law had not yet been compelled to name, because no one with institutional power had yet demanded that it be named. In most states, the honest answer to the question of what legal category these children occupied was none of the above. They existed in a legal void, and that void served the placing institution with precision, because accountability within a legal void is structurally, almost architecturally impossible to demand. Not all placement operations worked within identical frameworks or served identical constituencies. The New York Foundling Hospital, under Sister Irene Fitzgibbon's direction, dispatched its own trains primarily to Catholic communities in the American Southwest, and in 1904, one of those placements generated an incident that stripped the program's charitable surface away entirely and exposed, with unusual clarity, the racial and religious ideology operating beneath it. 40 Irish Catholic children were transported by a priest named Father Mandin to Clifton, Morenci, Arizona, where they were placed with Mexican Catholic mining families. Families that met every standard of material stability, religious compatibility, and community standing that the Foundling Hospital applied. Within days of the placements, Anglo-Protestant townspeople organized, entered the homes of the receiving families, and physically seized the children, claiming that the placements constituted racial degradation and that Irish Catholic children could not properly be raised in Mexican Catholic homes. The case reached federal court. The court upheld the seizure. The language of the ruling did not assess the welfare conditions the Mexican Catholic families had provided. It did not examine whether any child had been harmed. It defined a suitable home not by the safety, warmth, education, or religious observance it offered, but by the racial identity of the adults providing it. The Mexican Catholic families were disqualified as parents not by evidence of harm, but by what they were. The court had written, in plain reviewable legal language, what the placement system had always assumed in operational practice, but had never been forced to state in a document subject to public scrutiny: that parenthood was not a universal human category available to all people on equal terms, that some families counted as families in the eyes of American law and some did not, and that the institutions empowered to make that determination would not be required to justify their criteria in language that those excluded could legally challenge. This is precisely the institutional logic that a Russell Sage Foundation investigator named Hastings Hart had begun to document in 1884. In a report to the National Conference of Charities and Correction that remains, measured against the evidentiary standards of careful institutional critique, a genuinely damaging document, Hart found children who had received no follow-up contact from the placing institution since the day they arrived at a receiving home, in some cases for years. In some cases, for what the surviving record suggested was the entirety of their time in placement. He found no abuse reporting mechanism of any operational kind within the Children's Aid Society's field structure. He found ledger entries that terminated not with outcome assessments, not with any measure of a child's educational progress or physical welfare, but with the administrative notation "whereabouts unknown" applied to human children who had simply ceased to appear in any institutional record and about whom the institution had generated no further inquiry. He documented cases of children used as unpaid farm and domestic labor with no educational provision, no legal advocate, no adult with any institutional obligation to hear a complaint, and no pathway by which a complaint, if registered, would reach anyone empowered to act on it. The Children's Aid Society did not suppress Hart's report. Suppression would have been, from a public relations standpoint, more dangerous than the alternative the institution chose. What the cast did with Hart's findings was more sophisticated and more revealing about how durable institutions manage inconvenient evidence. It cited the report selectively, deploying Hart's meticulous documentation of systemic failure as a rhetorical argument for expanding the cast budget rather than restructuring, curtailing, or subjecting to external review the practices Hart had documented. The abuses entered the public language of philanthropic appeal and simultaneously disappeared from the categories of internal institutional accounting. The annual reports of the Children's Aid Society for the same years presented placement success figures. They contained no category for labor exploitation, no category for educational deprivation, no category for whereabouts unknown. Someone operating at a level of the institution with access to both Hart's findings and the annual report template made a decision about which numbers would enter the public record and which would remain in the operational ledger. That decision was not administrative oversight. The gap it created between the public document and the internal record did not close over time. It survived, intact, waiting for someone to eventually place the two documents side by side. Homer folks, whose 1902 systematic examination of American child welfare practices reached the National Conference of Charities and, eventually, the policy conversations surrounding the White House, was among the first to argue in sustained published form that the Placing Out program contained structural failures that no amount of additional charitable funding could repair because the failures were built into the program's design, rather than arising from insufficient resources. His critique contributed to the convening of the 1909 White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, organized by President Theodore Roosevelt, which produced a formal resolution declaring that home life was the highest and finest product of civilization and that children should remain in families of origin wherever this was possible. The resolution was widely cited in the years that followed as evidence that the federal government had recognized, named, and morally corrected the excesses of the Placing Out era. It appeared in reform literature as a turning point, but the resolution contained no enforcement mechanism of any kind. It included no retroactive provision for the more than 100,000 children already placed across the country in the decades preceding 1909. It created no federal registry of placed children. It established no process by which a placed child or a searching parent could use the Declaration's stated principle to compel any institutional response. Julia Lathrop, who became the first director of the United States Children's Bureau when Congress established it in 1912, pushed consistently and with evident frustration for meaningful federal oversight of child placement practices and met the organized, well-funded resistance of a system that had operated for nearly 60 years without external accountability and had built its institutional identity and its donor relationships entirely around that freedom. Charles Loring Brace Jr., the founder's son, was still publicly defending the program's record. The government had decided, in the language of a formal resolution, what should happen to dependent children in America. It had not decided to stop what was actually happening to them. The trains continued running for 20 more years. In the 1,890 seconds and into the early decades of the 20th century, something occurred that the Children's Aid Society's archive had not been designed to accommodate and had not anticipated as a variable requiring any structural response. The children placed on the earliest trains had grown into adults with memories, with questions, and in some cases, with the resources and determination to pursue answers. They were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Some returned physically to New York. Some engaged lawyers. Some wrote letters to the CAS offices. Some arrived in person and asked to see their records. What they encountered was not a sealed archive, not a formal legal prohibition, not an explicit refusal. What they found was something structurally subtler and functionally more complete. A filing system, organized entirely and exclusively around the administrative act of placing a child outward. Records were sorted by train departure date, by receiving town, by the name of the local agent who had facilitated the placement. They were not cross-indexed in any way that permitted a placed person to locate their own file by working backward from a childhood memory and an assigned surname. The archive had been built on the operating assumption that the movement of children was permanent, unidirectional, and unreviewable west, away, final, and that no one would require a mechanism for reversal, because the institution had not imagined that reversal would be sought. There was a form for placement. There was no form for return. Some writers, working through fragmented records held in scattered state and university archives, found notations they had not anticipated seeing. Parent living, location known, written in the same ink in the same hand, on the same ledger page, as the record of their own transport to a farm or household hundreds of miles distant. The absence of any reunification mechanism was not, by any reasonable structural assessment of how archives are built and what their organization reveals about institutional intention, an oversight born of administrative haste. It was a design feature, the logical and durable expression of a system that had never intended its placements to be revisited, questioned, or undone. By 1920, 29 states had enacted laws requiring prior state approval before out-of-state children could be placed within their borders. The legislative debates producing these restrictions are illuminating in ways their authors almost certainly did not anticipate would be subject to later analysis. The recorded language of those debates does not foreground documented child welfare failures. It does not center Hart's 1,884 findings, or the whereabouts unknown entries, or the labor abuse cases that reform literature had been circulating for 2 decades. It centers on community character, on local labor supply, integrity, on the right of receiving states to control what kinds of people, what ethnic compositions, what religious affiliations were being introduced into their economies and their social orders. States had observed that placed children, growing into adolescence and early adulthood, did not reliably remain the permanent, compliant, geographically fixed agricultural labor the placement system had implicitly promised receiving communities. They left farms when they were old enough to leave. They moved to towns. They competed in local labor markets. They carried Irish Catholic and German Catholic identities that some receiving Protestant communities had not anticipated absorbing in the numbers the trains were producing. The restriction laws protected state labor economies and cultural compositions from pressures the trains had created. In states with entrenched Protestant political majorities, they functioned simultaneously as barriers against the continued entry of Catholic children from the New York Foundling Hospital's competing placement trains. The program was not ended by moral reckoning. It was ended by economics, by demography, and by the accumulated self-interest of the states that had once welcomed the trains and had since calculated the full cost of what they had agreed to receive. The states didn't end the orphan trains to protect the children on them. They ended them to protect themselves from the consequences of what the trains had delivered. The last official orphan train departed in 1929. No government commission reviewed the 75 years of operation. No federal audit examined placement outcomes across the 250,000 children the program had moved. No state conducted a systematic review of how many placed children had had living parents at the moment of their removal. The Children's Aid Society recorded the program's end in its board minutes as an administrative transition to a logistical pivot toward urban social work. In an era when federal restructuring of social welfare had made the old end, placing out model both organizationally unnecessary and politically inconvenient, the program ended without ceremony, without published retrospective, without a single public accounting of what it had been, what it had done, or what had happened to the people it had processed. No congressional hearing examined its record. No commission of inquiry was convened. No institution with a hand in the program's 75 years of operation produced a closing document that attempted honestly to answer the questions the ledgers raised. It didn't end with an investigation. It ended with a memo, and the memo did not ask what the trains had carried, only that the trains would no longer run. In 1986, in Concordia, Kansas, a woman named Mary Ellen Johnson founded the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America. The surviving riders, then in their 70s and 80s, the youngest of them, having been placed as small children in the program's final years, began meeting in church halls and community rooms across the Midwestern towns where the trains had deposited them decades before. They pooled fragmented memories, requested records from university archives, and began comparing what the official public records said about them with what the internal ledgers actually showed. The ledgers noted parent living in files where the annual reports had said orphan. The gap between the two documents was not ambiguous. The archive had maintained two simultaneous and contradictory narratives, one calibrated for donor appeal and public legitimacy, one recording operational reality, and had not calculated that both would be preserved indefinitely in separate archival collections that could eventually be placed side by researchers with sufficient patience and access. The institution had forgotten the most fundamental property of documentary evidence, that archives, unlike the institutions that create them, do not choose what they remember. They keep everything, indiscriminately, and they wait. The 250,000 children placed between 1,854 and 1,929 received, in the great majority of documented cases, new surnames at the moment of placement. In many receiving states, informal name changes generated no court record and produced no legal documentation that would allow a descendant, a century later, to trace a current family name backward to a birth identity recorded in a New York tenement registry. An estimated 2 to 4 million Americans alive today are descended from orphan train riders, most of them without any knowledge that they carry this history in their genealogy, in their inherited medical conditions, in the blank spaces where a family origin story should be. No outcome registry for the 250,000 was ever compiled. No institution involved in the program's operation attempted, at any point during or after its 75 years of activity, to produce a systematic accounting of what had happened to the children it had placed. State adoption statutes enacted during the mid-20th century sealed records retroactively, applying closed-record legal frameworks to placements that had never been legal adoptions in the first place, creating access barriers around files that had never formally been open to access requests, building a legal wall around information that the original system had not thought to protect because it had not imagined the question being seriously asked. The law did not erase the children. It made them structurally, legally, genealogically impossible to find from the outside, and then it filed the mechanism under routine administrative procedure. Today, in Concordia, Kansas, the Orphan Train Heritage Society Archive holds oral testimonies, fragmented placement records, and the accounts of riders and their descendants who spent years and in some cases entire adult lifetimes trying to reconstruct what was taken from them in a single administrative entry on a ledger page. No federal program has ever attempted the cross-referencing work that would be required to determine how many of the 250,000 placed children had living parents at the moment of their removal. No government has commissioned that study. No institution that participated in the program's operation has funded that research. The question has not been officially asked, and the absence of an official question is itself a kind of answer. An answer about what the institutions involved have calculated. It is safer not to know. The count of 250,000 sits in the historical record officially classified as a welfare statistic, a measure of charitable intervention, of urban suffering addressed, of progressive American philanthropy, operating at the scale that a confident and expanding nation made possible. One reading of the evidence is different. One reading of the evidence, grounded in the ledger notations and the seasonal placement data, and the court ruling that defined parenthood by race, and the archive that had no form for return, suggests that 250,000 is a displacement statistic, a count of separations, of genealogies severed without legal proceeding or parental consent, of mothers who grew old and died in Lower East Side tenements, having spent years trying to locate children who had been classified, on a morning when they were seen unattended on a public street, as belonging to no one. The system called itself rescue. The archive calls it placement. The writers called it, variously, salvation and theft, sometimes in the same sentence. Because for many of them, both things were simultaneously and irreconcilably true, and no single word the English language offered was large enough to hold both at once. What it was, precisely, depends on which document you read, which institution produced it, at what moment in the program's history, and for whose eyes it was written, and whose eyes it was written to avoid. The train stopped in 1929. The question of what they carried has not stopped. It has simply been reclassified, without ceremony and without debate, as settled history cataloged under philanthropy, cross-referenced with American progress, and stored in a drawer that most people have never thought to open, in a room whose existence most people have never been told to look for.